to our third episode of the Catholic Mass series. Last week, we saw what we are meant to gain from the Mass, the four ends, or what do we and God get out of it. Today, we'll see why it is so important that we have a liturgy at all. And so, what do we mean when we say liturgy? What is the reason for people gathering together to perform a religious ceremony? Is it something that we do naturally as humans, or is it something that God Himself has told us to do? And also, we'll explain what all this has to do with a bunch of pagan, rich, patriotic Greek men in the time before Christ. On sspxpodcast.com/mass, you'll be able to find all of these episodes, videos, and resources. This is free to listen to and always will be, but if you can help with a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation, you'll be making sure that we can continue this work of producing good Catholic content on a regular basis. Now, let's join Father William McGillivray for the Catholic Mass, Episode 3. Father McGillivray, it's always good to have you. Thanks for joining us for this liturgy series. How have you been lately?
Very well, thanks, Andrew. Well, it's the end of the school year here. This is actually our last day of school.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so very excited about that. We have graduation ceremony this Saturday. And then, it's a time when actually my classes are over. I have still a little bit of grading left to do, but at the same time, I'm juggling a few projects, which are very interesting in themselves. Obviously, the podcasts that I've prepared for the liturgy series. At the same time, we have teachers' meetings at the end of the school year. And I've prepared a presentation for the teachers on the relation between grammar and philosophy, because I teach philosophy at the high school level here. And so, obviously we don't have many philosophy teachers, but we do have a lot of grammar teachers. And it was our school principal, Father Dabity, who asked me to speak on that subject. And it just so happened that I'd read something very interesting in one of the works of Garrigou Lagrange on that very subject. So I said, sure, I'd be happy to take that topic. And so I've been doing research, and it's just a fascinating subject area.
That sounds
yeah.
great. I mean, speaking for the listeners here, or maybe it's just me, maybe you and I can chat again about that at some point, maybe do a one-off interview about that, because that sounds fascinating. That'd be cool.
And it's funny, obviously there's a lot of interesting quotations that come up on that subject line. And one of them, which was actually brought to my attention by Father Dabity, is it's a quote of Nietzsche, who says that, I'm afraid, he says, that, people will never cease to believe in God as long as they continue to believe in the rules of grammar.
Interesting.
So there's a lot to explore there, but we can save that for another podcast episode.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it one of these days. Fantastic. Well, so you're busy with that and busy with the liturgy series. We have you on for a couple episodes. I think you'll be on here in another couple weeks as well. And this series is a little bit different in terms of kind of how we've laid it out. Normally we start with the very broad, and then we kind of get into specifics. And in the first couple episodes, Father Robinson and Father Reuter have looked at specifically the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. And then here with you this week, Father, we're going to take a step back and look at liturgy just in terms of what is liturgy, not in terms of the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. Obviously, it's going to lead to that, but that's kind of where we're going to be starting today. So I'll start with a really broad question like we always do with these episodes, Father. What is liturgy?
Okay. Yeah, a great question. And I myself, in the process of preparing this podcast, well, maybe first I can explain on a personal note, my first 5 years of seminary, I was in the MC department. So it was my responsibility to research the ceremonies and explain them, teach them to all of the servers and sacred ministers that would be involved. It's a lot of work on the material level. There's a ton of details to learn, to master, and to choreograph. At the same time, it was our goal to understand the meaning of the ceremonies too. I would say that the topic of liturgy has been very important to me. But to be totally honest and transparent, I'd say it was kind of a love-hate relationship in the sense that the amount of work that goes into preparing one of these pontifical ceremonies for Holy Week or for ordinations, it's enormous. It's grueling. To the point that sometimes you don't have the time that you'd like to spend, researching the meaning and all of that. Sometimes you're forced by time constraints to remain pretty much on the material level. But I would say I was exposed to a fair amount of literature on the liturgy during my time as an MC at the seminary. But however, most of those who have written on the liturgy, at least in recent times, they're part of what we call the liturgical movement, which started off well under the impulse of figures such as Dom Guéranger, Pope St. Pius X, but which did pretty quickly deviate. And I'd say as well, so when you read a modern author on the liturgy, even one before Vatican II, you have to be careful. There's a lot of modernists mixed in there, and even those who aren't modernists may well be influenced by those who are. So you have to tread carefully in that territory. And then on the level of spirituality, I'd say there's sometimes a kind of false mysticism, or even those who are good authors tend to write in such a poetic language that you want to say to them, well, just get down to say something concrete, say something which is theologically precise as well, because there's just a lot of poetic language which is kind of fluffy. Anyways, this is kind of the baggage that I had going into this topic. So my first reaction was to say, well, we're all Thomists here in the society. I love St. Thomas. So let me just do a word search in St. Thomas for liturgy. See if I can come up with a definition or something helpful on that subject line. And so I searched for liturgy. I've got all the works of St. Thomas in Latin in one text document. So I put in Liturgia, Liturgicus, all the different variations of Latin words for liturgy. Nothing, absolutely nothing comes up. So I say, okay, all right, I've got to talk on liturgy, but apparently St. Thomas had nothing to say on the subject in all of his collected works. So
for a minute, were you like, oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah, for more than a minute. So then I go to councils of the church. Let's look at so I'm not gonna include Vatican II in my word search because we know there are problems there. So let's look at all the other councils of the church. I'm going to put in the word liturgy. Once again, nothing in Vatican I, nothing in Council of Trent, nothing. Okay, well. The church fathers must have something to say on this subject. So I go to, the collected works of St. Augustine, search for the word liturgy, nothing. So I'm starting to think
Are you confused at this point? Because I am.
Yeah. Well, I was pretty confused.
Okay.
So,
all right, good.
So I continued to do research, and I eventually found out that the word liturgy in the Latin language was, and therefore, in the Romance languages as well, was introduced by humanists in like the 16th century, 16th or 17th century. So this term was not brought into the Latin language and therefore not into, Western languages in general until pretty late in the game, so to speak, pretty late in church history. And it was originally the humanists who were going back to, classical and even pagan authors, who found interest in this term and revived its use in the West. And this is why, for example, there's been a Roman congregation which is dedicated to liturgical matters, which was founded by Pope Sixtus V in the year 1588, if I recall well. And so, we would assume that such a congregation would be, called the Sacred Congregation of Liturgy or of Liturgical Matters. But no, its name has always been the Sacred Congregation of Rites or Rites and Ceremonies. And that's because up until, the influence of the humanists in the 16th, 17th centuries, there was no such word in Western vocabulary. And so instead one spoke of the rites and ceremonies of the church. One spoke of the divine office of sacred ministry, ecclesiastical ministry. These are the terms that were in use. Liturgy was not in use. And so that interested me greatly and sent me on kind of a quest for, the origins of the use of this term, especially in our Western vocabulary. And, I had studied Greek in high school and continued to study it privately in seminary. and had painfully worked my way through the Septuagint, almost got all the way through after a lot of work. And I remembered from that so the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, originally written obviously in Hebrew, and it was translated into Greek in Alexandria in Egypt between like the 300 and 100 BC roughly. And the Greek word for liturgy, which actually is Greek in origin, liturgia, that comes up all the time in the Old Testament. But on the other hand, if you do a search for that word in the Latin Vulgate or in the Douay-Rheims, liturgy doesn't come up at all. So that too added to my mystification. But it does show that the word for liturgy was used in the context of the worship of God from a very early date, even before the time of Christ. So that's kind of the beginning of my search for the term. You've got to search for the term before you can search for a definition of the term. Right. So it's true that I don't want to take too much of our time in this podcast talking about this, which is more you could say an intellectual curiosity. I'll explain briefly the solution that I found to this problem. And then we can move on to the theology of the liturgy according to St. Thomas and Pope Pius XII.
Spoiler, we're not just talking about grammar. We're talking about Greek grammar to start. No, I'm just teasing you.
That's right. Yeah. Let's go into then the origins of the term. I mentioned its use in the Septuagint, but even before that, we have the use of the term liturgia in a broader sense, meaning public service. This was used by the pagan Greeks since ancient times. Liturgia, which derives from laos, meaning the people, and then ergon, which is work. So the adjective for laos, for people, is leita. It becomes leita erga, public works. And then that is kind of fused together into one word, liturgia, meaning public works, public service. And it originally referred to public services that like private individuals would undertake without any kind of monetary compensation, but because it was their civic duty. And that applied to all kinds of things, including the worship of the gods. But it wasn't originally just a term referring to ritual worship of gods. Aristotle, for example, in his Politics, he has a phrase where he speaks of hypostos deus liturgiae. So literally the public works toward the gods. So you had to specify that we're talking about public services with regard to the gods, because there were other kinds of public service too that went by the same name. And
if I'm not mistaken, this liturgia, this idea of the Greek public works, it wasn't just about sacrifice to the gods. It was anything. It was setting up schools or any sort of charitable work as well. But then, like you said, they define part of it as liturgia to the gods. So it's kind of this idea of public works and sacrifice to the gods and setting up the liturgy as part of the domain of the rich, as part of a civic duty.
Yeah, for sure. It is striking to us because we obviously have a different mentality formed by millennia of Christianity, our Christian culture, and even before that, even the Jewish conception of God was quite different from the pagan Roman or Greek conception. And so to us, it seems a little bit weird to consider the service of God in the context of public worship as a service that you perform to the gods, kind of like you perform a service for your municipality or for the state, doing something to help people out. Is the worship of the gods something that we do to help them out? Well, obviously, no. In a correct theological understanding of what worship is, God has no need of us. But in fact, we have to recognize that the pagans, they had a very degraded and anthropomorphical understanding of the gods. Even the fact that there's a plurality of gods is already an indication of that. And so for them, they considered the gods as being, in a certain sense, in need of ritual sacrifice, which is satisfying their thirst for victims, for the blood of victims. And anyways, there is perhaps some theological baggage that was originally associated with the Greek term. And as you mentioned, it's not very precise. It could refer to any kind of public service done, whether for the gods or for the state, or for one's community, even. I imagine. So yes, but nevertheless, it remains a fact that the term over time became kind of crystallized in referring specifically to public religious ceremonies, and as such, it was adopted and used by the Jews who translated their sacred writings into Greek. And I already mentioned, though, that in the Septuagint, so there's in fact. Let's say that the Septuagint is a rather loose translation. It's usually not a translation word for word of the original Greek, Hebrew text. And so where the term liturgy occurs in the Septuagint, it is interesting to note that there's normally not an exact equivalent in the Hebrew, nor in the Vulgate or in other translations like the Douay-Rheims, which are based upon the Vulgate, which itself is based upon the Hebrew. So just to give an example of this, like if we look at Exodus 30, 18 to 20, in the Douay-Rheims, which again is based ultimately on the Hebrew text, we have Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and feet in the brazen laver, when they are going into the tabernacle of the testimony, and when they are come to the altar to offer on it incense to the Lord. So there's nothing about liturgy there, at least that I can see in the Douay-Rheims. But if we go to the Septuagint, the translation, if we want to translate the Septuagint passage into English, it would say when they go into the altar to do the liturgy and to offer holocaust to the Lord. Later again, the related verb is there. And there's just nothing in the Hebrew text or in text based upon the Hebrew, which corresponds to that. But it's a translation according to the sense. So, obviously, if the priests are going into the tabernacle of the testimony to offer incense or holocaust, all of that is comprised in the general category of the public worship that the priests were offering to God in the name of the people, and that is what liturgy is. So we already find, in fact, the term used in its proper sense in the Greek Septuagint several centuries before the coming of Christ.
So there is sort of this connection between the Greek rich people doing public service for the people. And now in religious terms, in the Jewish sense, and we're going to get into the Old Testament, I think, in a couple episodes, Father, but the priests are doing a public worship on behalf of the people. It's the same sort of thing.
That's correct, absolutely.
Sort of, right? It's loosely connected.
No, there's certainly a strong analogy between the two. So it's not surprising that the term should be adopted and used that way. However, we should note that when it comes to the Christian use of the term, in fact, it seems that although this term does figure in the Septuagint with reference to the liturgical services of the Aaronic priests, the priests of the line of Aaron, we don't find it used immediately in the context of Christian worship. Around the 4th century, the term does come into use by the Eastern Church Fathers, who, of course, were speaking and writing in Greek. They do use the term liturgia, but they use it as a synonym for the Mass. So, interestingly enough, in early Eastern Christian literature, liturgia, liturgy, it refers to the Mass, which, indeed is the center and summit of our liturgy. It's the most important part. So not surprising, but we should just note that in Christian literature, in Christian terminology, it hasn't yet acquired the same signification as it will have later on.
Okay.
But if we fast forward, a few centuries later, in the East, it does already have that sense of the modern sense of liturgy, meaning any public worship that the ministers of the church offer to God in the name of the entire church. And so, for example, I found it in the texts of the Second Council of Nicaea, which was held in 787 AD. The word is used in the Greek text in the modern sense. Although in Latin, as we'll see, the Latins had not yet accepted the use of such a term because it's not of Latin origin. And so if you wanted to say liturgia, you're just borrowing a word from another language. It's an import. And so the Latin Council Fathers preferred to translate liturgia as a ministerium or ministry, which is a more generic term which was in use in the Latin language. So that's one of the terms that we find as a kind of loose equivalent for liturgy in early Latin texts, ministry or ministerium in Latin.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So there we go. As I said then, it's only in the 16th, 17th centuries that the Latin Church adopts this Greek term. Because there was no precise equivalent in Latin. And so eventually, through the influence of the humanists, they started to use this Greek term to Latinize it and to spread it around in the Romantic languages as well. So I did a little search in the Bullarium. So it's kind of the collection of papal bulls predating the modern collection known as the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, which was begun under Pius IX. Before that, you have the Bullarium Romanum, collection of Roman bulls, which goes back to very ancient times. And there's like 22 volumes of this that you can find online in the Internet archives. And it was in the, trying to find where I have this. It was in the 17th century. I think that I found the first reference to liturgy in an official papal document. It was under Clement the, let's see if I can find this. Under Clement the 12th, I think it was around the year AD 1732. One of the last volumes of the Bullarium Romanum, I finally found the term come up in a papal document. So, early to mid 18th century is where it first starts being used in an official capacity in Rome.
Wow. Just the 18th century. That's fascinating. Okay. So obviously that makes it a little bit difficult there's going to be different terms that are going to be used all throughout the early, well, not the early church, the majority of church writings, frankly.
Yes.
So not to make this about you, but just so that if other people want to start researching this as well, what words did you use? How did you start diving into the history of the liturgy without using the term liturgy?
Yes, well, exactly. A great question. Well, my first interest was to find something in St. Thomas, but I'd say the same rule applies in general. If you're searching, Western church documents prior to the 18th century, well, you're going to have to look for words that are roughly equivalent, such as rite, ceremony, ministry, office. Those are the only words available in the Latin language, their Latin equivalents. And so that's what you have to go with if you're doing a word search for such things. So in St. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica and elsewhere, I was able to find passages where he spoke about the rites and ceremonies of the church. And that will help to throw some theological light on the subject. So we can dive into that if you don't have any other questions on the subject first.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's dive into St. Thomas because that's where you started. That was your first source that you were going to look for. So I'm sure he has a couple things to say. Thomas usually does.
Just a few.
Yeah. Okay.
No. There's a good amount of things that there's no question. In fact, for example, in the Summa, which treats of the rites and ceremonies of the church as such, but he will treat of them in connection to each of the seven sacraments and in connection to, for the Mass, it's actually a question which comes at the end of his treatment of the Holy Eucharist. He has a question about, the rite, in which the Holy Eucharist is celebrated. And there he treats of the Mass and its rites and ceremonies. So you'll find things on the Mass. You'll find things on the sacraments. It's usually the last question that occurs in the Summa on each one of those subjects. So for baptism, for confirmation, for the Eucharist, he has he treats of the rite in which surrounds the administration of the sacrament. Because as we'll see, the liturgy is chiefly concentrated in the Mass and the sacraments, but also in the divine office, which St. Thomas doesn't seem to have too much to say about. The chanting of the Psalms. I don't think he has too much to say there, but he certainly does have things to say about the rites of the Church in connection to the Mass and sacraments. Okay. And then also, so that's kind of the exterior aspect of the liturgy, but there's an interior aspect too, which would be the virtue of religion, which is I want to say it's a potential part of the cardinal virtue of justice. Justice, which inclines us to give to each one what is due to him. And so there's a potential part of that virtue, which is called the virtue of religion, which inclines us to give to God the reverence, the signs of reverence and worship and homage, which are due to him. St. Thomas would call it a potential part of justice, because the virtue of justice in its perfection entails a perfect correspondence or equality between that which is given and that which is received. That's what we find in commutative justice. Right. Whereas the virtue of religion, although it's nobler than the virtue of justice in general, it does fall away from the perfection of justice as regards equality between that which is given and that which is received. Because obviously, we receive from God far more than we can ever give him, and even what we do give him comes from what he himself has given us. But anyways, to return to the point, where St. Thomas discusses the virtue of religion, we find things that pertain to the internal aspect of liturgy. That is to say that in participating in the liturgy, we are exercising the virtue of religion, which is an interior quality inhering in our soul, which inclines us to these acts of liturgical cult, among other things. And St. Thomas would divide the virtue of religion itself into several acts. My screen just went blank.
Oh no.
Okay. Oh no, I see you again. Were you able to hear me that whole time?
Yeah, I could.
Okay, great. Then I'll just continue. So St. Thomas divides the virtue of religion into its various kinds of acts towards which it inclines us. Internally, there are the acts of devotion and prayer, and then externally there are the acts of adoration and sacrifice, or more broadly, oblation. And so we will look at some of those passages because they have relevance to liturgical cult. But I think if we're going to dive into St. Thomas, I would start with actually his treatment of once again the etymology or the meaning of the terms that we use to refer to liturgy. We won't find the etymology of liturgy itself with him because the term wasn't yet in usage at his time. Mm-hmm. But he does give, interestingly enough, an etymology of the term ceremony. And we find this not in the Summa, but in St. Thomas's commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, which is one of his earlier works, and which in general is more detailed. It goes into more of the minutiae. So you can find some things there that are not reproduced in the Summa later on in his life. And there he speaks of ceremonies and gives the etymology of the term, saying, well, first of all, that those things are called ceremonies which do not have any obvious reason for the way in which they are done. Although they may have an obvious reason for their institution. Now, I'm just going to pass on that and come back to it later, because at the end of this podcast, I'd like to speak a little bit about this obscurity of the liturgy. Many of the ritual gestures, their meaning is not always obvious to the uninitiated, and so we'll go into the reasons as to why that is. But he begins by saying that ceremonies are things which let's say they're outward gestures, rituals, which are not always obvious as to their signification. And then he goes on to say that they are called ceremonies, being, as it were, the offices of Ceres, which is the pagan goddess of the harvest. In fact, it's from the name of this goddess that we derive, for example, the term cereal in English, meaning originally grains, because she's the goddess of the harvest. And it seems that in antiquity, ritual sacrifices were offered, first of all, to this goddess for the purpose of obtaining, a plentiful harvest, and then later on, the term referring to these ritual sacrifices offered to the goddess Ceres, which would have been ceremonia, like munus in Latin is a gift or service, and then Ceres would be the name of the goddess. So that becomes ceremonia in Latin. So these services to the goddess Ceres, the term for them is then applied to all ritual sacrifice or all honors given to the pagan gods, which are expressed through external gestures, prayers, actions. All of that is called ceremonies. So that's the etymology of the term.
That's fascinating. My brain is already thinking about titles for this episode on YouTube and trying to think of clickbaity ones. And first thought that comes to my mind is Kellogg's and the Mass, more connected than you knew. I don't think that one's going to pass muster, but yeah, it's worth a shot. But it is interesting. Same thing, not the same thing, obviously, but the same root. That's fascinating.
For sure. So there you go. You have a very interesting definition or etymology of ceremonies in St. Thomas. Yeah. I searched for an etymology for the word rite in his works, and I couldn't find anything. Maybe it's there and I just missed it, but I didn't have success. And so I looked in just a standard Latin dictionary, the word ritus, to see if I could find something. And in fact, it seems that the etymology of rite is unknown. We don't know. But if I were to give a real definition of it, let's say, what is the, when we say a rite, obviously we mean an external series of prayers and actions, which are performed in the context of public worship. But what seems to really distinguish the word rite from the word ceremony or the word liturgy is that the word rite places the emphasis on the legality of the thing. That is to say that these are the gestures which are ordained by liturgical law. And we see this reflected in the use of the adverb rite in Latin, which in the strict sense means in conformity with liturgical law. And then it came to mean just in conformity with the laws in general. So there's always a kind of legality, a notion of legality implied in that of the term rite.
Interesting.
So that's what I have for etymologies. Anyways, go ahead.
That's etymology. That is fascinating. If you had told me when I was in 7th and 8th grade, I'd nerd out about etymology and grammar, like we talked about at the very beginning, I'd probably slap myself. But it is fascinating once you start following all those little threads. It's
sure.
Really cool.
Sure.
Okay, so that's St. Thomas and the etymology of ceremony. What does he say about the theology of it? And we're going to get a lot more into theology as we go in this series, but just from a broad starting point.
Yes. So first of all, St. Thomas explains that liturgical worship is a duty that all Christians have, let's say all baptized members of the church, in virtue of the character itself of baptism, which deputes them to liturgical worship. And the same is true as well of the other characters, the other sacramental characters, such as the character of confirmation and the character of holy orders. All of these sacramental characters, and you'll see this if you look up the questions in St. Thomas on the subject of sacramental character, in the section on the sacraments in general. He says that these characters depute us to liturgical worship, although in different ways, and each one of them is a participation in the priesthood itself of Jesus Christ. The sacramental character conforms us in one way or another to Christ's priesthood. And so that's why there is a certain sense in which all of the baptized have a priestly character, although obviously we have to be careful in the way that we speak about that, because it's very different from the ministerial priesthood. In fact, baptism deputes the faithful to liturgical worship. But as far as the sacraments are concerned, the power which baptism gives to the faithful, the baptismal character, is a passive power. It's the power to receive the sacraments and to benefit from the public prayer of the church. But they're not in a position to confect the sacraments, that's for sure. The character of confirmation is, in a sense, passive and in a sense active, because the grace of confirmation, it's a grace of strength, of fortitude. And so those who possess this character of confirmation, they more easily have the strength to overcome the obstacles that would prevent us from participating in liturgical worship and receiving the sacraments. For example, in a time of persecution, the grace of confirmation will give you the fortitude necessary to despise the dangers of certain pandemic-related regulations and other such things, which might tend to prevent us from fulfilling our duty of receiving the sacraments.
Just purely in a hypothetical here?
Yes.
Of course.
But anyways, so there are certain worldly forces which might intimidate us or pressure us into withdrawing from liturgical worship and from the sacraments. But the character of confirmation helps us to be manly, to be soldiers of Christ, and to continue to worship despite those obstacles. And then finally, the priestly character obviously gives the power to, an active power, an active participation in Christ's priesthood. So one is able to confect the sacraments, at least certain of them, if one is a priest. And obviously one is deputed to lead Christian worship and not merely to participate in it. But that's the first teaching of St. Thomas on liturgical matters. It's the relationship between the sacramental characters and this public worship of the church, which I think is very interesting, very fruitful to meditate on, because each of us of the Catholic faithful that are listening to the podcast, we have at least that character of baptism, which already deputes us to liturgical worship. It's our duty, it's our privilege as baptized Catholics to do that.
Yeah. You mentioned duty, and we talked a little bit earlier about the idea of justice and how, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm summarizing you correctly, you said that man cannot perform perfect justice to God because we're unequal to him. So, but Thomas does talk about the virtue of religion as being a matter of justice. So how does he define that?
Yeah. So I'm going to quote here. I think this is question 85. I need to correct my notes. It's question 85 on sacrifice, Article 1, where St. Thomas explains the reason for sacrifice, but it holds true for all acts of the virtue of religion. He says, natural reason tells man that he is subject to a higher being on account of the defects which he perceives in himself, and in which he needs help and direction from someone above him. And whatever this superior being may be, it is known to all under the name of God. In fact, before going on, we could just pause there and say, that's very interesting, that little passage there, because it's like a little summary of, I would say, the fourth way of St. Thomas for demonstrating the existence of God by the degrees of perfection. Man giving, becoming aware of his own limitations, knows instinctively that there must be a higher being which is not bound by these limitations and upon which he must lean, he must rely for the help that he needs to attain his happiness. So there's this instinctive, natural knowledge of the existence of some superior being, which is not subject to our limitations and which is able to give us the help that we need. And then he continues, now, just as in natural things, the lower are naturally subject to the higher, so too it is a dictate of natural reason, in accordance with the man's natural inclination, that he should tender submission and honor, according to his mode, to that which is above man. Now, the mode of befitting to man is that he should employ sensible signs in order to sanctify anything, because he derives his knowledge from sensible things. So I cut off the text there for the moment, because if we leave it at that applies to all liturgical worship, although he's going to go on to speak specifically of sacrifice. That is to say, by the natural law itself, by our natural instinct, we recognize the existence of the superior being to which we must go to seek help in attaining our own happiness, and which we must also honor, because it's a dictate of natural law that we should submit ourselves to those beings which are higher, which are more perfect than us, and namely to God above all else. And the manner in which we do this must be externalized. It must be through certain sensible signs, because we are, let's say, a composite of body and soul. We are also a social animal. And so there must be an external, sense perceptible, and even, I would say, social aspect to this worship. And that naturally leads man to thus worship God in a public way. It's something which, unfortunately, in our modern world, we've lost this sense of the need for public worship of God, not only on the part of individuals, but on the part of society. As I believe Leo XIII explains in Immortali Dei, one of his encyclicals, he says that society depends upon God just as much as individuals do. Society would not exist without God. God is the author of society, and therefore man, even as a social animal in the context of society, has a duty to worship God in such a way that if our Lord had not instituted a church, if God had not instituted a sacred religious authority distinct from civil authority, it would be civil society itself which would undertake the worship of God in a public manner, which would be responsible for liturgy. If we lived in a purely natural order without public revelation, without the church, and this is what we see in societies living, let's say, in a state of nature, so to speak, that is without knowledge of revelation, whether it's the Greeks, the Romans, or other primitive societies. They all had ritual worship, specifically sacrifice, but other kinds of ceremonies, no doubt, as well, which were performed in the name of the society as such, in the name of civil society. There would be men deputed by society, authorized by society to act in its name and to offer sacrifice to God, or as they perhaps understood it, the gods, on behalf of society. And so St. Thomas here explains to us very, very eloquently the foundation of this behavior that we observe in all these ancient societies. It's founded in natural law itself and the dictates of natural reason.
Yeah, and we see that, right? We see that in pagan cultures. We see that in modern spirituality. I'm right near Sedona with all the crystals and the vortexes and all that. Like we there's something in us that seeks to find something greater than us and do something for or to or with that higher power, right? On a purely natural law level. It's there. It's baked into us.
For sure. And, I think I'm thinking of Father Gabriel Amorth, the exorcist in Rome, but it's probably not from him. But I know he would say that, when people cease to believe in God, they will start to believe in anything. And so you see that in these different superstitious practices in yoga and in these ceremonies that they do in Sedona around these circles with the energy that they're trying to transmit, whatever. Or, in the scientific realm, it's, the creative power of mutation and natural selection, or these, or blind natural forces, power of evolution, which is supposed to be able to produce everything spontaneously of its own. Ultimately, there's going to be some principle, some reality that you find, which you put in the place of God, and which you, whether you honor it with external ceremonies or not, there will be some created thing which you put in God's place. That's for sure.
Yep. So that's baked into us, right? St. Thomas is talking about, this need to do something. Then next step would be, what is that thing? What is that exterior thing that we do? And what does he say about that, Father?
Exactly. Well, obviously, the culminating external act of worship will be sacrifice, as we'll see in a moment. But it's important at the same time to recognize that it's not confined or limited to sacrifice alone. There's all kinds of external things that we do with our body and with our vocal cords as well, which which represent the submission that we need to show to God as his creatures. And so there's an article of St. Thomas, or a question rather, on adoration. And he explains that, obviously all of these external things, they must be signs of something internal. Otherwise it's hypocrisy. Otherwise it's just an empty pretense. So he says, this is in question 84, article 2 of the Secunda Secundae. He says, exterior adoration is offered on account of interior adoration. In other words, we exhibit signs of humility in our bodies in order to incite our affections to submit to God, since it is co-natural to us to proceed from the sensible to the intelligible. Just as prayer is primarily in the mind and secondarily expressed in words, as stated above, so too adoration consists chiefly in an interior reverence of God, but secondarily in certain bodily signs of humility. Thus, when we genuflect, we signify our weakness in comparison to God. And when we prostrate ourselves, we profess that we are nothing of ourselves. So it's very beautiful, very simple explanations of some of these gestures. Obviously a prostration, it brings you down to the level of the earth. You almost disappear when you prostrate. And you show your closeness to the earth, the dust out of which you're taken. The genuflection, it's almost like you're stumbling, or you no longer have the strength to hold yourself upright on your 2 feet. You sink down, and so it's like a gesture of weakness. And obviously, we can add to that in the context of battles. If someone is vanquished by the enemy and he wishes to plead for his life, he's going to throw himself at the other person's feet. He's going to get down on his knees, which is once again a posture of weakness, of helplessness. So there are these natural connections. It's if you will, baked into human nature, that this is how we express the interior sentiments of our soul with regard to God.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So then how do we get from this act of humility towards God to, which I guess is the next point, to sacrifice?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's necessary not only that we humble ourselves, but that we have to go beyond that, because we have to show that out of gratitude, there's a desire to give back to God something of what he's given to us. And it's this act of giving something back to God is precisely, it's a protestation, it's a professing of the truth that all that we have, we've received from him. And so in principle, we owe everything back to him, even our own selves. God is after all the master of life and death. He's the one who's given us life, and he has the right as well to take our life, to put an end to our life when he sees fit, which we see expressed in a striking way with the sacrifice of Isaac, where God is asking Abraham to show him, well, at least the willingness, the readiness to take away that precious life which God had granted to him in the person of Isaac, his beloved son. So there has to be this recognition that God is the master of life and death and of all things. All that we have, we receive from him, and we owe him a sign of our gratitude and recognition and submission. And this takes place in the form of offerings in general, what St. Thomas calls oblations. But more specifically and more perfectly, this is realized when we offer God something in such a way that there's no possibility of taking it back and reusing it for our own ends, our own purposes. And so this would be accomplished by the destruction, the immolation of the thing that is offered to God. And that thing which is to be destroyed in God's honor is called the victim. And the action of offering a victim to God is called sacrifice. And so we offer sacrifice to God when we remove something definitively from all profane or common use, so that it belongs to him alone. It's given to him and can no longer be used by us. Which is why, for example, all the sacrifices of the ancient law prescribed by the law of Moses involved at least a certain part of the victim being destroyed and offered to God. And the most perfect of the three kinds of sacrifice, sacrifice for sin, sacrifice of thanksgiving, or peace offering, and Holocaust, as we'll see in a future episode, the most perfect of these was the Holocaust, which burned the entire victim, and none of it was left to be eaten or enjoyed by those who offered it. So this is the idea. It's a giving of something to God in a definitive and irrevocable way by the destruction or immolation of the victim. So what I just said there was not quoting St. Thomas, but rather summarizing his thought. And so let me just then quote a few things from the article on sacrifice, which may help to further, let's say, illustrate this truth. So this is article question 85, article 3. And we have to first say that what I just described is sacrifice in the proper sense of the term. And St. Thomas himself makes this clear in the reply to objection 3 of this article. He says, a sacrifice, properly speaking, requires that something be done to the thing which is offered to God. For instance, animals were slain and burnt, the bread is broken, eaten, blessed. And the very word signifies this, since sacrifice is so called because a man does something sacred. I think a better English translation would be he makes something sacred. Facit sacrum in Latin. The idea of the sacred is so sacer, sacra, sacrum in Latin. It's something which is inviolable, which is withdrawn from common use and belongs exclusively to God. And so it's precisely the immolation which makes the thing offered inviolable, sacred, belonging to God alone, because it's been withdrawn by the act of immolation. It's been withdrawn from all human use. On the other hand, continues St. Thomas, an oblation is properly the offering of something to God, even if nothing be done thereto. Thus we speak of offering money or bread at the altar, and yet nothing is done to them. Hence, every sacrifice is an oblation, but not conversely.
Okay. Very interesting. So this is the idea is not that God needs something of this. He doesn't need whatever we are offering to him. It's an offering on our part to show that he's the master of everything, that we owe him something, even if it's imperfect. He doesn't need burnt up calves or sheep or whatever.
Exactly. Yes. I skipped over a quotation early on in the notes, which is there's one of the Psalms of the Old Testament which talks about this. It's Psalm 49. It's very beautiful. And I think it's appropriate to quote it in this context. So Psalm 49 verses 9 to 14, God is speaking to the Israelites, and he says to them, I will not take calves out of thy house, nor he-goats out of thy flocks. For all the beasts of the wood are mine, the cattle on the hills and the oxen. I know all the fowls of the air, and with me is the beauty of the field. If I should be hungry, I would not tell thee, for the world is mine and the fullness thereof. Shall I eat the flesh of bullocks, or shall I drink the blood of goats? Offer to God the sacrifice of praise, and pay thy vows to the Most High. Wow. Beautiful expression of this theological truth that God is not in need of any of our acts of religion. They are performed rather for our own sake, to set us in a relation of truthfulness with regard to God, so that we may ourselves know what is our true relation to him. Just as with prayer, God, St. Thomas has similar articles on prayer. God is not in need of us telling him the things that we desire or that we have need of. Prayer on God's side is completely useless, so to speak. He already knows. But prayer is actually there to dispose us to receive the things that we need from God with gratitude, knowing that, I asked for this and then I received it. So this is obviously coming from God. This is God's response to my prayer. But from a purely practical or utilitarian perspective, there's no need on God's part for prayer, and neither is there need of sacrifice. But sacrifice is there for us to put us in our proper relation to vis-a-vis God, with relation to God. So there we are. And that's why, obviously, so why were there, for example, animal sacrifices in the Old Testament? It's not because God was thirsty for the blood of goats, but it's because, in fact, we need a way to, graphically represent to ourselves our complete dependence on God, the master of life and death. And that, especially on account of our sins, God could justly kill us, could justly take our life, and it's something that we would have merited by our sins. And because our life belongs to him anyways, it's a gift from him. And because obviously it would be against the natural law, it would be wrong for people to take their lives in order to demonstrate this truth to themselves and to others. Instead, we substitute an animal for ourselves. The animal is the closest thing that we can find, which comes close to representing what is a human life without being, protected by the natural law. We can take the lives of animals without sin. And so we sacrifice them to represent this offering of ourselves and submission of ourselves to God's infinite majesty.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We know from the earliest sacrifice that we have record of, which is Cain and Abel, right? That's the earliest one. Adam and Eve was in.
That I know of, yes. Yeah.
That we know of, yeah. That liturgy can be good, sacrifice can be good, sacrifice can be bad. So I bet Thomas talks about that a little bit too.
For sure. And in fact, he speaks of, he's already said that in general acts of religion, including adoration, sacrifice, their principal element is the interior act of the virtue of religion, the act of devotion, of prayer, of man offering himself to God, of which the external element is simply a complement, a necessary complement. You can't do without it, but it's still secondary in importance. And at the same time, let's say the internal element is often represented by the term sacrifice used in a broad sense, and we can make sacrifices in the broad sense far more often than we can make liturgical sacrifice. We can do liturgical sacrifice. And St. Thomas in his reply to objection 2 of the same article, he speaks of this, these different meanings of the term sacrifice, especially as referring to this interior element of giving oneself to God. So to quote St. Thomas, he says, man's good is threefold. There is first his soul's good, which is offered to God in a certain inward sacrifice by devotion, prayer, and other like interior acts. And this is the principal sacrifice. The second is his body's good, which is, so to speak, offered to God in martyrdom and through abstinence or continence. Observing the precept of purity of mind and body. And for religious, for priests, celibacy is even more so a sacrifice of the good of one's body, of bodily pleasure. And then the third is the good, which consists of external things. And of these, we offer a sacrifice to God directly when we offer our possession to God immediately, and indirectly when we share them with our neighbor for God's sake. So even almsgiving indirectly is a sacrifice of our external goods to God. So taken in this broader sense, which doesn't imply necessarily a destruction of a victim performed in a visible manner, but it's just the offering of something that belongs to ourselves to God, depriving ourselves of something. It has these different meanings. The offering of the soul itself to God by devotion, prayer, and other interior acts. The offering of our body to God through chastity, and the offering of our exterior goods through oblations, through acts of almsgiving.